one way or another. Can you all hear me fine with mic here? Is that coming through? Is the camera picking up the everything? Check 1, 2, 3, 4. All right. We'll give it a minute or two more just in case anybody else filters in. Generally, I always say there's 2 time periods that you try to stay away from if you're planning anything for church folks. The week between Christmas and New Year's, and then the whole month of July. So I don't anticipate that we'll have too many people here, but we'll have a good crowd, let's say. Yeah. Well, the ghetto fingers, I mean, they kind of put their finger on the scale. Sure, no, let me get in your way.
my honor to introduce Mike because I know him as a man of deep faith, a faith that informs his life choices, a man of prayer, a great husband and father. We are blessed to hear how God has worked in Mike's life and hear about his faith for him. I know you'll be uplifted and drawn into a greater appreciation of your own faith and reflect on the amazing grace bestowed on Mike and his family. So with that, I turn you over to Mike.
I was expecting just to hear my headphone.
You know, the only trouble is if you don't use the microphone, people listening out talking.
Is my microphone on right now? Can you hear me?
I can hear you, but I can't.
Oh, how about now? Is that working? User error. All right. So Father Steve, when he had asked me to give this talk, he's wanting to do these quarterly breaks from Sunday school. Originally, I had no idea what to talk about. He just said, I just want somebody to do whatever you want. And it's an intimidating request, the idea of just standing in front of a bunch of people that you know. It's less intimidating when you don't know anybody, but a bunch of people that you know, most of whom the only thing they know about you is that they see your kids around. They hear the sound of your kid hitting the pew every week, and that's Mike's family, or that's more like the Vanda's family. But it was after Mike Allen's talk, when he was back here in March. He gave a talk a few months ago about the hard reality that so many young people are exiting the church. And that's troubling for a lot of us. It's troubling. I can't imagine what it's like to be a parent if your own child is one of those young people. But it was after that talk, Father Steve came back and said, you ought to do a talk on the opposite side of things, right? Mike did a talk, the other Mike, the older Mike, did a talk about why young people are leaving the church. He said perhaps it would be good to do a talk about why at least one young family came back into the church, or not back into, just into the church. And I thought that made a lot of sense because it's a good question. Why would anyone choose to be part of this? Because while the trend is certainly going in one direction, last I heard that for every Catholic or every new Catholic coming into the church, there are 8 Catholics who have left the church. While the trend is certainly going into one direction, there are still plenty of people out there that are searching for something. We still frequently have new people coming into our doors searching for something. And it's a very human phenomenon of searching that I want to talk about this morning. When we ask a question like, why Catholic? That's the title of this talk, why Catholic? That's a question that assumes that we're searching. Why Catholic is asking, why did you decide that the search was over once you found Catholicism? Why is Catholicism the answer to life's biggest questions? But even then, we need to take a step backwards, because before we can talk about why Catholicism is the answer to life's biggest questions, it would help if we took a moment to be on the same page about what exactly those biggest questions even are. And to that, I would say there's 3 big questions. I'm going to refer to them over and over again this morning. 3 big questions that I think every human struggled with. And for the sake of plagiarism, you should know I did not come up with these. I don't remember the name of the woman who I heard say this. She's from Fuller Theological Seminary. So I can't give her credit, and I'm sorry, I can't point further. But she's the one that I heard break it down like this, and it made sense to me. That there's 3 questions of life. There's 3 things that every human on earth struggles with, even if they don't realize it, are this. To whom do I belong? What is my purpose? And what is my identity? The first is, to whom do I belong? So we have to have that sense of belonging. We have to have our people. Sometimes we find that in groups of friends. Sometimes we find that in institutions. Sometimes we can find that sense of belonging in sports teams, either as a player or as a fan of the team. But that's a question, is who are my people? We can see, anybody can observe and see humans are communal by nature. We just come together. But there's more to that question than who do I happen to be surrounded with? And there's more to that question of who do I go to when I need X, Y, or Z? There's something more to that question of belonging than who's my plumber. We want to belong. Humans want to belong to something that's bigger than ourselves, something that represents something greater than just us. The second question that all humans struggle with is, what is my purpose? What am I supposed to be doing that will bring some kind of sense of fulfillment? Again, every animal on earth has a drive to meet their basic needs, but humans are unique, as that's not enough just to eat and drink and be busy with taking care of these natural physical needs. We have to know we're aiming towards something. We have to find fulfillment in our work. We have to have greater meaning to our labors beyond just checking items off the to-do list. And a lot of people, they try to find that maybe in their day jobs. Some people find that sense of purpose in parenting, or others find it maybe in volunteering or doing church work, coaching at the Little League, whatever it may be. And often this is related to belonging. To belong to somebody means I have some kind of feeling of responsibility with that somebody. But we have to have that sense of purpose. And then that last question is, what is my identity? Who am I? What kind of man or woman am I? And I think that's the toughest one, because this is the one we're least likely to realize we're even asking ourselves. But it's more than just, what do I do? What do I fill my time with? I've heard somebody call this the eulogy question. When I die and someone stands up to eulogize me, hopefully they have something more to say about me than, well, he did this job for 40 years, and then here's who his siblings were. Hopefully they have more than just a list of facts to say. We want people to think something about us. We want people to know who we are. We want some kind of identity. And all three of these questions, I genuinely believe that everyone has, even if we're not particularly aware that we're wrestling with these things. A sense of belonging, I think an example you often see is in sports teams. And why is it when you go to a UK game, everybody's wearing blue, right? We want to signal, this is who I belong, this is my people. Why when you go to you can go to a certain political rally and everybody's wearing red hats? Because these are my people, right? Why is that when we're struggling with this sense of purpose, that we want people to know what we do, we want people to know why we do it? We struggle with these questions. We want to be known. And when those answers are settled in our lives, we feel content and we feel happy, and things just kind of go off. But when those answers start to get called into questions, when those things start to feel challenged, we start to get that sense of restlessness. We start to feel like things aren't quite right. And if that doesn't get answered soon enough, if we don't find a way to settle these important fundamental questions of where do I belong, what's my purpose, and who am I? If it doesn't get settled soon enough, it turns into a full-blown crisis. So you can think of it this way. The joke, there's that proverbial midlife crisis, right? The middle-aged man who realizes he's not some young stud anymore, and so what does he do? He goes out and buys a sports car. But a more serious example, I've known a lot of people who have retired from their job. They lose that sense of purpose that came with working, and soon after retirement, they turn into an anxious mess, just trying to figure out, what am I going to do with my time? What's my purpose anymore? I've known people who, when their kids have grown up and they're empty nesters, there's that sudden kind of vacuum in the house of, what are we doing here? My house is empty. And a lot of times it's not a big, this great big traumatic change that brings around these differences. Sometimes just life goes on. But it's precisely these crisis points when we begin to ask these questions of, who do I belong to? What is my purpose? And who am I? It's when we hit those crisis points that we go searching. We can't be content to just leave these questions unanswered. And it's in the process of that searching that we can talk about conversion. We can't leave these questions unanswered. We have to find the new thing. We have to settle these issues for ourselves, these foundational questions of our lives. And that leads us to making change, and that change is conversion. When we've reevaluated to whom we belong, and when we have reevaluated what is my purpose, who am I, what is my identity, that's what it means to be a convert. And I do fully believe that God uses these moments. He sometimes leads us to this place where these fundamental questions of life suddenly aren't being answered how they used to be answered. Maybe it's some brand new experience that's making me see things differently. Or maybe just the old answers just aren't hitting the chord anymore. And he uses these moments of searching to call us back to him. Our gospel this morning, seek and you will find, ask and you will be given, and knock and the door shall be open to you. So I start that way because I want to set up what this talk is about. I'm going to start by telling a series of stories about my own conversion into the Catholic faith. I'm going to tell a series of stories about my own struggles with belonging, with purpose and identity, these things that have led me into the Catholic Church. But I want to start here talking about conversion in general, because my hope is that by telling these stories, this can be an occasion for us to collectively reflect on two things. One, to reflect on God's work in our own story of conversion. And two, to reflect on what is the church's role in walking with people as as God calls the world back into relationship with Him. And some of you might be thinking, well, I didn't convert. I've been Catholic my whole life. But the church calls us to constant conversion, calls us to constantly stepping away from sin and towards Christ. Even if you have been sacramentally Catholic your entire life, you have at some point in your time wrestled with these deep, foundational, fundamental questions of who do I belong to, what is my purpose, and what is my identity? And you have probably likely not answered those quite as fully as God would have you. So I'm hoping that these stories can be a chance for us to reflect on that, to reflect on the church's role in that. If you walk away, I hope this is interesting to you, but if you walk away at the end of this and the best you can say was, that was neat, then I will consider this talk not a success. I want this to be an opportunity to think about conversion in general. Now, for telling my story, I debated for a while of where I should start, because my story is very typical in that it wasn't just one grand moment of conversion. I just didn't wake up one day after having some miraculous dream and boom, now I'm Catholic. My story, like most people, is a story of little conversions over a very long period of time. But we have to be cognizant of time. We're already 20 minutes in. We can't be here all day while I tell you every little thing that's happened to me in my life. So I don't want to dive into childhood per se, but I do want to say a few words about just how I grew up. And if there's one thing that is unique about my story, it is that I have been religious my entire life. And that's not necessarily unique in the grand picture thing, but for people my age group, for millennials that we get labeled as, roughly 40% of them don't identify as any particular religion at all. For Gen Z, which is current 20-somethings and college students, they're the first generation in American history where the majority, just over 50% of them, have never had any kind of Christian memory from their own childhoods. They never set foot in church until someone died and they went to a funeral. So there is something unique in that. I have always, my entire life, been going to church. I grew up going to a Disciples of Christ church with my mother, my extended family. They were all Methodists. They belonged to St. Paul United Methodist Church in Louisville. And in my middle school and high school years, I was a member, or I attended Springdale Baptist Church. I was part of their youth group. I went there on Sundays. And how all of us ended up at different churches across Louisville, that's a different story for a different time. But my point in starting is that my teenage years, those big questions of life, that question of who are my people, what is my purpose, and where do I belong, the church was able to answer this for me. I belonged to the people of Springdale Baptist Church, that little Southern Baptist church in Louisville. My purpose was to become a pastor. I was going to go to college. I was going to go to seminary. I was going to be a preacher. And if you had asked me about my identity, I would have just said, I'm a Christian. I'm a good Christian little boy. And in high school, that worked out fine. But then, so I graduated high school and I go to UK, and something very important happened. It's something that happens to just about every young person when they go to college. Your sense of belonging is suddenly thrown into question. You've packed up, you've moved to a new city, you don't know anybody, and overnight, you find yourself surrounded by 25,000 people the same age as you, all just doing this weird thing. College it's like adult summer camp, somebody told me once. It's 4 years it's hard work, and it's a lot of important stuff, but it's kind of a blip in life, right? But you suddenly find yourself in this new and exciting situation, but you don't belong anywhere. And for a college student, that's kind of a scary thing. Now, I'm going to take it aside because this does happen to most college students. If you know someone who's going to college in this next fall, encourage them to get involved somewhere. That loneliness can overtake you. Not belonging somewhere can be hard. But for me, it was an easy answer. I knew what I was going to do. I was going to go to college, and I knew I needed to find some kind of campus ministry group. There's only one problem. When you get to UK, it's a very big campus. There are hundreds of student religious organizations. And I think that might be literally the case. There might be literally hundreds of student religious organizations. Every denomination under the sun has their own group. There's groups for denominations I had literally never heard of before. There's religious groups that are organized around theological positions that I didn't know people were even debating. There was, you show up and you have to go find somebody, and of course there was the Baptist campus ministry. There was the Newman Center for the Catholics. There was a Wesley Foundation for the Methodists. There's also this Reformed campus ministry. I didn't know what Reformed meant at the time. There was Lutherans. There was Episcopalians. There's 30 kinds of non-denominational. There was Campus Crusade. That's the one that people talk about a lot, but the previous spring, the campus minister had been fired for having an affair with a student. So I felt like I scratched that one off. That wasn't going to be for me. And they were all very friendly, and they all wanted me to join them. And it was exciting, but you kind of fell into this rhythm of doing the college equivalent of church shopping. You jump around, you visit this one, you visit that one, and how much can you really learn about a community and about a people after just spending an hour? But you're overloaded by the number of choices. I had friends that I came to UK with. I knew people. I wasn't at risk of falling into loneliness quite yet. But it didn't take long before me and my friends from high school, when we got to UK, we just naturally started to drift apart. You become friends with people in high school because you're just stuck together, right? And you got to be friends with somebody, but we were just pursuing different things. There was no great falling out. We just went our own ways. And so this is the oversimplified version of the story, but it is a typical college story. But by the time you get to October in that first semester, when you're a college student, you really start to feel homesick because that lack of belonging, that lack of your people, it starts to get to you. So I remember it was in October, and I'm starting to feel this. I'm feeling that pressure and that temptation to start going home every weekend. And again, if you have any college students in your life, a grandchild, encourage them not to fall into that trap of going home on the weekends. They'll never find community if they don't. But it was a Thursday night. It was in late October. It was just before Halloween, and there was a knock on my door. I opened up. There's a guy in my hall. I had seen him before, and he was dressed like a doctor. And he was holding a pair of scrubs, and I'm not sure the kind of look I gave him, but I said hello, and he just pushed the pair of scrubs towards me. He said, "We're going to a Halloween party. Has a costume contest. Wear a man short. Will you be in our group?" And I looked at him and said, "Well, what are you all going as?" And he said, "We're the doctors from Grey's Anatomy." And I said, I've never seen that show. And he says, "Neither have I. This was not my idea." And that was good enough for me. So I don't know. Yeah, it was Ian Banta who came and knocked on the door. Ian, I was a co-best man at his wedding. He was a groomsman of mine. So a little preview of where the story's going. He was a good friend. But that was good enough for me. I threw the scrubs on. I got in the car with this group of people I'd never met before, and we went off to this Halloween party. And I got there, and I realized that this party, I didn't know who was throwing it, but it was thrown by CSF, the Christian Student Fellowship. And it was their annual party. It's several of these every year. And I didn't know a soul there, didn't know a single person. I didn't even know the guys that I drove to the party with. But man, was it a fun party. There was no alcohol. No one was hooking up in the closets. It wasn't one of those kinds of parties, but people they were dancing, they were talking, they were having fun, they were having this grand old time. But most importantly, when I was standing there, surrounded by 200 people I'd never met before, I felt like I was just one of the group. It felt like the most natural thing in the world to be there. And that is how I found my Christian community at UK. That's how I found my belonging. CSF, that's their whole thing. If they were a Catholic group, we would use this language of charism. Their charism is that they throw really good parties. But more seriously, CSF is a ministry that they just focus on living life together. They do Bible studies together. Every Thursday, they come together for worship and preaching. And they call themselves a multi-denominational ministry, not a non-denominational ministry, which that'll come back in a second, why that was important. And just about everybody who worked for this ministry was graduates of Asbury Seminary, which, again, not to spoil the story too much, but that's where I would end up going. Now, I want to pause this story for a moment just to reiterate what I said before, that belonging is the first step of this conversation. That's one of those fundamental questions in life that has to be answered. I was a Christian. That wasn't a doubt. That identity was there. I still knew I was heading towards seminary. That sense of purpose was still present. But I needed to belong. But despite trying out all these different ministries, why was it that CSF got me? Well, I had a mentor once. It was years ago. It was right before I was ordained a deacon. And he said, once you're a pastor, I want you to be aware of this. He said, every person who ever walks in the doors of your church, whether they realize it or not, every person that walks in the doors of your church, when they meet you and shake your hand for the first time, they're going to be asking you one specific question. So they won't realize they're asking the question, but they are going to be asking this question. When they shake your hand, they're going to wonder, is this person going to love me? If you can answer yes to that, then you can minister to them. If you can't answer yes to that, then that's the end of this relationship. That's what belonging is, being able to answer yes to that question. Are these people going to love me? So CSF, why did that become my community? It's Christian Student Fellowship. Because when I hung out with them, they answered yes to that question. Are these people going to love me? Now later I would learn that Ian coming to my door and inviting me to that party, that was not by chance. Several years before, there's a group of guys that got together that asked these questions. How can we reach people on campus better? How can we be around them? They knew that just walking around the sidewalks, engaging people in theological debates was not the way to go. They knew relationship had to be the foundation. So what they did is they all applied to live in the same dorm together so that they could create this community and invite people into that community. 4 of the 6 RAs, the resident advisors of our dorm, were members of CSF, half a dozen guys on my floor, and that was their whole ministry strategy. They came together, they hung out in a common area. They invited people to come to Bible studies, but they also just had fun and just lived life together. We went to class together. We did all these things together. So that need being taken care of, that need for belonging settled, I was able to turn and focus on answering and developing these other big questions of life. What is my purpose? What is my identity? I still felt called to be a pastor. And after my freshman year, I spent that summer in an internship in Wisconsin, working as a youth minister for 4 months. I made a lot of mistakes, made a big mess out of a lot of things, but it was a very good experience for testing these waters and figuring out, is this really what I'm called to do? And when I got back, I was able to join the leadership team at CSF, and for a total of 7 years, I was part of that ministry team, meeting people on campus, inviting them into Bible studies and leading Bible studies and all the rest. And so the 3 years I was at UK and 4 years after. But it was through all those experiences of testing and affirming that call that I began to feel more and more that not only was I called to be a pastor, I felt like I was called to ministry, but specifically, there's something that felt like I was called to be the kind of pastor who used his mind well, who would serve the church through teaching and preaching. And it seemed more and more important to me at this time. I'm 19 and 20 years old. It felt more and more important that I spend my days trying to understand the faith as much as possible. I was at UK, so it's a secular campus. There is no religious studies degree. So I declared my major in classical languages. I studied Greek and Latin so that I could read the New Testament in its original language. They didn't offer Hebrew at UK. I minored in philosophy. I minored in history, using that to justify as many classes I could in ancient and medieval life and thought, trying to immerse myself in philosophy. And we did discuss theology in those courses, but from a very different perspective. But in fact, I tried to create my own Christian studies degree. And it was in that process of trying to understand our faith that I started to become, I would say, almost obsessed with these differences in Christian denominations. Intuitively, I knew that the Baptist church and that Baptist youth group I attended, as much as I was thankful to them for welcoming me as a teenager, intuitively, I felt it was very different than the mainline Protestant faith I had grown up in, the Methodists and disciples. But I couldn't have told you how. I couldn't have told you why. But as I learned more and more about the history of the church and trying to make this homegrown Christian studies degree, the more and more it began to bother me, just how fractured the Christian world truly is. Jesus himself commanded us to be one as the Father, as he and the Father are one. For us to be one as he and the Father are one. How do we let ourselves get to this point? Or even in a place like Kentucky, we have hundreds of denominations present. And that's one of those regards in which I think it was God's providence. I know it was God's providence that I found a place like CSF, which understood itself as a multi-denominational ministry, not a non-denominational ministry, Because CSF gave me a place where I could explore these denominational differences. It was a place where I could find people and say, hey, can you introduce me to your Presbyterian pastor? Can you introduce me to this guy? I could sit and have coffee. I can ask questions. And so CSF, I had a reputation as a guy who was intensely interested in trying to understand these denominations. Yes, I had an interest in theology and biblical scholarship, but I just want to know these Christian groups. And so a friend of mine, a guy named Matt Dampier, he is currently an Anglican priest in Texas. One day he came up to me and he said, hey, a friend of mine invited me to a breakfast that some Catholic priest is putting on at a Panera Bread this Saturday. He said, he's setting it up just so Protestants like you can come and ask questions. Would you like to come? So of course I said yes. So I get there, I meet this guy named Father Frank. I didn't catch his last name until 15 years later. It's Father Frank Bronner, if any of you have ever met him. Met this guy named Father Frank, and it was exactly as you imagine. It was just a round table, Father Frank at the head, and then a bunch of us Protestants just sitting in a circle. And what a brave man he was. He just opened it up and he said, just give me your questions. And we just, one after another. And I'm more diplomatic by nature, but some of the people there were they were trying to convert him. they were trying to get him. But Father Frank is such a brilliant man. Still is. He's over in Stanton, Kentucky. He's a priest there. And he knew his audience so well. Not only did he have a good answer for all these questions we were asking, every question, he had some good, well-reasoned and thoughtful answer. But he also could point back to the scriptures for every single question. He knew his audience. For a bunch of Protestants, he wasn't going to impress us with talking about the magisterium of the church. I was so impressed with that conversation I had with Father Frank that it was a Saturday, so the very next day, that Sunday, I got in a car and I drove to Christ the King Cathedral, and we went to Mass. It was my first time ever going to a Catholic Mass. And I don't know what I was expecting. I genuinely can't remember, but I know what impressed me. I came in and you can't avoid the beauty of that space. It's physically imposing, the symbolism and the statues. There's a massive crucifix hanging over the altar. It's instantly a place that demands reverence. And I came in and I sat down and I'm nervous. I'm worried about being outed, right? I don't know, the first thing you're supposed to do in the context of a liturgy, I didn't know if I was even allowed to be there. Was I undercover, right? I remember I get there and we all stand up and the procession comes in and I look over and we're processing in and the priests and the deacons, but then following up there, somebody carrying this big gilded book. I thought it was the Bible. Now I know it's just the Gospels, but coming in with the Bible, and so in the back of my mind, it's I was told Catholics didn't read the Bible. But then there's this priest on a Saturday who just knows this thing better than anybody. Father Frank knew that. And then now we're all standing like it's a bride coming into her wedding, processing and watching the scripture come down the aisle. Blew my mind. And we get into the liturgy, and no, I don't know the words. I'm just listening. I'm trying to mouth things. Again, I don't want to be caught. I know. But I'm listening, and no, I didn't catch every scriptural allusion, but I could tell we're quoting scripture throughout this entire hour. I mean, we listened to 3 readings. That's more than I did at my Methodist church. We always just had 1 reading on Sunday. We're listening to these readings, these liturgies, this recitation of scripture, this back and forth. And the whole thing was just so disarming. It was not what I thought it was going to be. I was so amazed that I began going every Sunday. I began going to weekday masses. I started taking people with me, my Protestant friends. So you got to see this. You got to come to Mass with me. I took Vanna with me. We were just friends at the time, weren't dating. So you got to come to Mass. You got to see this. It's not what they told us it was. And I did that for almost a year. And eventually I got to the point where I could not deny that, boy, does it seem like the Catholic faith is the true faith. I couldn't deny that all my studies, this kind of like self-made Christian studies degree I was working on, all these studies pointed to the Catholic Church as having the best claim to being the original church that Jesus and his apostles founded. I couldn't deny that the most of our theological traditions, most of these conversations of the last 2,000 years happened under Catholic scholars, that most of our prayer traditions, who taught us how to pray, happened under Christian monks and nuns, Catholic monks and nuns. I was troubled by all the divisions in the Christian world, But it's pretty hard to deny that it was the Protestants who left the Catholics, right? Like I felt like I was on the wrong side of this equation. I was becoming more and more convinced that this was true. But I hope you can empathize with me what that revelation truly meant. Let's go back to those three questions. Three things every person struggles with. To whom do I belong? What is my purpose? And what is my identity? The idea of converting to Catholicism was a direct attack on all three of those for me. It called into question belonging. I'm a 20-year-old. Just to remind us, I'm 20 years old when I'm having this conversation with myself. Who was I going to belong to? I had to leave behind the churches that I knew, and I had to leave behind this ministry. And I could probably stay at CSF, and those people would be friends, but there would be a gulf there. And now that we have converted, there is a gulf between us and our Protestant brothers, friends. We're still very good friends with some of our people we went to Lawrenceburg United Methodist with. But there's something there between us that wasn't there before. I was right to be worried about that. But my belonging would call into question. I couldn't belong to the same groups. My identity was called into question. I felt called to be a pastor. And in the Protestant world, to be a pastor meant I was going to have married, I was going to have babies, I was going to do all this stuff. But if I became Catholic and I followed that calling to be a priest, none of that. And at 20 years old, that was a terrifying idea. And that sense of identity, I thought of myself as a Christian, right? That was my identity. To be a Catholic Christian, yes, Catholics are Christians, absolutely. But it is different. And it's something new, and it's something that no one around me was going to understand. So I was 20 years old, faced with this prospect of losing my community, faced with this prospect of never getting married. Me and Vanna weren't dating yet, but I kind of liked her. I had some thoughts about her, right? The prospect of everything changing. But I couldn't get it out of my head. I knew it was the right thing. So I remember one day, it was a weeknight. I went to Mass. I was hoping to see Father Frank. I found out later Father Frank had since been moved. That's why I never ran into him again. I went to Mass one evening. I went to it was a weekday Mass. I don't remember what day of the week. And after Mass, I went up to that priest and I approached him. And I introduced myself and I asked him, how do I become Catholic? It was the most terrifying thing I'd ever done in my life up to that point. I go up to this priest and I say, how do I become Catholic? And that priest looks at me and he lets out a big sigh. He was clearly annoyed I interrupted him, whatever he's going off to do. So he pulls out a pen and he scribbles down the phone number. He says, we'll call Sister so-and-so. Now, don't judge that priest too harshly. If you're curious, he's not a priest in this diocese anymore. I've heard he's down in Texas. So I won't tell you his name or anything. But he gave me that number, and man, I was not about to muster that kind of courage twice. I never called that number. I was never going to call that number. I want to go back to what my mentor told me that I said a second ago, that every time somebody walks into a church and they introduce themselves, in the back of their mind, they're not conscious usually that they're asking themselves, but in the back of the mind, they're asking you, is this person going to love me? Well, when I walked up to that priest, though I did not realize it at the time, what I was asking was walking up to him and I said, hey, I want to do something that's terrifying. If I do that, are you going to love me? Unfortunately, that priest said, no, I'm not. The reason I did not become Catholic sooner, the reason we didn't come into the church until 5 years ago, it was not an intellectual hang-up. It was not that I wasn't convinced. No more arguments were going to get me there. No more evidence was going to get me there. It's not that I couldn't find smart enough people to hang around or people who would defend the faith well. It wasn't a matter of taste and preference. It wasn't that it wasn't fun enough to attract me or that they didn't have the best benefit package. The reason I didn't become Catholic when I was 20 years old was because I wasn't sure that if I did become Catholic, that there would be anyone left who would love me. Truth takes a back seat when you worry about something like that. Humans, we can rationalize anything if that's what it takes to find belonging. Fundamental question, where do I belong? Who's going to love me? So I gave up on becoming Catholic. I decided it was enough to be a fan of the church. The Protestants, we have this view of when Jesus talks about his church, he's not talking about a specific institution. Protestants kind of take that more as a general, the faithful. I said, that's good enough for me. I had to pick a denomination, though. I couldn't continue this kind of back and forth, and so I settled on the Methodist Church because it was my family's church. It was the family's denomination. My grandfather was Methodist, and my grandfather was the greatest man I ever knew. He had to know what he was talking about. Plus, Asbury was Methodist, and all the ministers I knew at the time were Asbury graduates. They surely had it together. Now, for the sake of keeping this story to a reasonable time limit, which I'm not doing, I'm going to try to jump forward very quickly through the next couple of years and what begins to happen after this. So Vanna and I, we did get married about a month after I graduated from UK. And that next fall, after getting out of UK, I enrolled at Asbury Seminary. So in terms of those questions of belonging, purpose, identity, belong to the United Methodist Church. Purpose was to become a pastor, identity still just to be a Christian. But if I'm honest, that to taking on a more academic understanding, I'd become very intellectually arrogant, I think, at this time. And so it was I wasn't just a Christian, but I was a really smart Christian, right? I was going to stop at this point and just say a few words about what seminary is like, because it's not what you think it is. I'll just say a few brief words, because people have an idea that seminary is like a specialized school. You can go to law school, you can go to medical school, you can go to seminary. And you'd be forgiven for that because you do take classes, and at the end you do have a degree you can hang up on your wall. Key difference between seminary and those other places is that seminary is a place where you are being formed to be ministers. Not just learning, but you're also being morally formed. You're being spiritually formed. You're being formed in just basic human competency. How to just be, halfway decent. When you go to a seminary, one of their goals, and you'll have at least one professor who makes this very explicit and very clear, one of their goals is to talk you out of ministry. Because better you figure out that I'm not actually called to this while you're in here than to get out in a church and then start making a mess of things. And so seminary is an environment where it very intentionally challenges you. They want you to struggle with these things. I had a professor who he overstated it a bit, but for dramatic flair. He said, my goal, I'll consider it success, is either you walk out of here as an atheist or you walk out of here as a man devoted to holiness. But he didn't want to leave that kind of in-between, lukewarm focus. But the other thing that happened at seminary that needs to be mentioned for the sake of this story is of course, your theological studies, you're studying all of Christianity. You're not just studying the Protestant church. You're not just studying Methodism. You have to master and wrestle with all 2,000 years. And as part of my theological studies, I had to take a coursework in sacramental theology. And I was fortunate enough to study the sacraments under our Dean of Chapel, Dr. Bob Stamps, who was the guy that was in charge of the entire spiritual formation of the seminary. So I'll try to keep this short, but Dr. Stamps was a man who loved the sacraments, and his love was absolutely infectious. Prior to seminary, I hadn't put that much thought into the sacraments myself. Methodism is a sacramental denomination. But Dr. Stamps pounded into us that the sacraments are the center of the Christian life and center of worship. The sacraments are we use this language in the Methodist world, of the means of grace, that there's certain places in our life where we know that He has promised that He's going to show up in a special and unique way. God's grace can be evident and present everywhere, but there's certain places where we know God shows up, and that's in the sacraments, that's in service to the poor, and that is in the scriptures. So Dr. Stamps pounded into us the necessity of the sacraments, and he had this infectious love of the sacraments. He saw sacraments as the gift that God gives us to step into the divine life. It's not just kind of an interesting fact that Jesus became man. That's just kind of a side note. But the reality is that by Jesus becoming a man and ascending into heaven, there's always a place for humans within the life of the divine Trinity. There's always a human sitting at the throne of God. And therefore, we can have that confidence. There's always a place for us as humans when we belong to Christ to take our place there. I get to seminary and trying to think the best way to put it. It was fine. It's probably the best way I should put it. It was challenging. It was every bit what that professor tried to make it. It was very hard. But honestly, the biggest takeaway is I walked away from seminary and I just felt disappointed. I had this kind of idea, again, going back to these three questions, in terms of belonging. You go to seminary and they just start integrating you into the life of the denomination you're about to be ordained into. And yet you get there and you look around and it's just like, these people are kind of disappointing. They're not as holy as I was hoping they would be. They probably thought the same thing about me. And I've worked for the Catholic Church several years now too, and I say it's about the same thing. There's some really good and holy people in these denominations, but there's a lot of people that just are kind of disappointing. They're not who you would hope they would be. Again, I don't say that as a judgment. I say that as they all said the same thing about me. In the sense of that purpose, you go to seminary, you want to be empowered to do better ministry, and I'm learning all these amazing things, and we're diving deeper and deeper into the life of the church. And every week I'm driving back to Lexington to continue this work at CSF, these discipleship groups with these young men. And it's just, the ministry's not getting more fruitful. It's just a lot of work, and it doesn't seem to matter. It doesn't seem to pay off. And in terms of that identity, like I said, my identity had started to become much more intellectually focused. I was not just a Christian, but I was a smart Christian. And that just felt hollow. Who cares? It doesn't mean anything. It doesn't matter. That doesn't satisfy that identity as much as I thought it would. By the time I got to the end of seminary, I was there for 3 years, and I graduated. I finished. But man, I was just done. I was burned out. It was tiring. It was not what I thought it was going to be, and I didn't want anything to do with this. And so I'm wrestling with this. And again, those three questions, all three of these fundamental questions were thrown back into disarray. If I get out of seminary and don't go into ministry, if I don't go work for the church, I mean, who am I? What am I doing here? And so I remember praying very intently just about a month before I graduated, and I felt almost like this quiet voice in the back of my mind of just saying, God, please help me figure this out. And I felt God say, when you get out of here, you're going to go work at a BB&T. It's a bank. And that didn't make me feel a bit better. But after I got out, I started applying to all kinds of places I had to work. And the only people that called me back was the BB&T in Winchester, Kentucky, where I was a bank teller. And it was miserable. All three of these fundamental questions were just completely thrown astray. So I spent a year at that bank as a bank teller, hating every minute of it. And I am trying to speed this up. I didn't realize how long I've gone. I spent a year at that bank and just feeling in misery, just wondering what went wrong. Why are things not clicking the way it did? And I heard a friend of mine gave me a call. And he said, hey, my kid's school is looking to hire somebody. They need somebody who can teach Christian studies and Latin. It's kind of an interesting combination, right? Well, that's something I can do. And he said, you'd be interested. And I didn't even pray about it. Anything but the bank is going to be a step up. So I did. I applied, and I got hired. And that was my first introduction to being a teacher. And I got to tell you, man, I fell in love with those kids. It was so exhilarating. It was fun. You get to see these young people's lives and their joys and in their struggles. You get to see them dealing with faith and belief. You get to see with all the normal teenage stuff. But it just felt so real after so many years of kind of being in this ivory tower version of Christianity, this very academically focused version of Christianity. I got around these young people, and suddenly everything's just life again. And people are just living, they're just trying to figure out life. And as a teacher, you get to spend 30 hours a week with these young people. Some of their parents didn't see them as much as I saw them. And you get to know them in such a real and intimate way. And it wasn't the popping in for an hour of Bible study like I had gotten accustomed to. It was living life with these young people. It was revolutionary for me. It was real ministry is what it felt like. So I started to joke. I mean, after the end of that first year of teaching, I started to joke. The only thing that could make this better is if I didn't have to grade papers. I could go and hang out with these kids and just get rid of the school stuff. That'd be perfect. And Vanna was the one that started to say, well, why don't you go back into ministry? Why don't you resume your pursuit of ordination? And so at the end of my second year at the school, and again, just rediscovering all three of these questions, just a complete rediscovery of what is that sense of belonging? Well, belonging isn't just now this thing of who are my people, who's going to serve me, but belonging is this thing of being a gift for other people. Who can I give myself to? That's where belonging started to find that meaning. This sense of purpose. It wasn't just what job am I entitled to because I'm the smartest guy in the room, but it was a sense of purpose of how can I serve these young people and be Jesus to them in some small way, not fullness. I don't want to replace God, obviously. But all this stuff comes into question. And so 3 years after I graduated seminary, 2 years after teaching at school, it just finally clicked. This is what ministry needs to be. And so I call my conference. The United Methodist Church were divided into conferences. I called the conference and I said, I'm ready to resume the pursuit of ordination. Because of the timing, it just worked out very well. I was able to get in right under the wire. It was that season where they were appointing people at churches. And so because I had completed school, because I had already kind of been in the system, I was declared a candidate for ordained ministry pretty quickly. And then by April of that year, the superintendent, it's one of the levels of administration, he called me and says, you're a candidate. I've got a church for you. I want you to go there and serve, and you'll fulfill your candidacy in that church. And he said, it's this little chapel outside of Winchester, Kentucky, in Clark County. He said, I'd like you to be the senior pastor there. There's only half a dozen families. And I told him, that sounds terrifying. That's intimidating, right? I just had a 3-year hiatus. I had this kind of questions about, do I even want to do ministry? And suddenly you want to be in charge of this small chapel. And I said, but I tell you what, instead of being the pastor of that little chapel, I heard through the grapevine that this church in Lawrenceburg was looking for a youth minister. Could I go be the youth minister there and fulfill my candidacy at Lawrenceburg United Methodist Church? And the superintendent said, yeah, sure, whatever. He didn't care. He just had to get people placed and get things moving. And so I went there, and since I was a candidate, I did have to interview for the position. It couldn't just be imposed upon them. But they said yes, and that's how Van and we ended up in Anderson County. Now, I know at this point it sounds like I've lost track of the story of conversion, that I've just started going on talking about myself. But the next couple of years at LUMC, things, in terms of those 3 fundamental questions, things just started to click. I love that parish, that church. I loved being one of the pastors at that church. I really liked that community. Van and I felt like we belonged. We had 2 of our children while we were there. Actually, just as kind of a background note, my first Sunday was supposed to be April 3rd, 2016, but Connor was born March 31st, 2016, so we had to push back to... So all these, big life things happened at LUMC, and it was wonderful. So 2016, I started at Lawrenceburg United Methodist Church. By 2018, I got word from the bishop that been proved to ordain me as a deacon. And so in June of 2018, I was in Northern Kentucky, and I stood alongside 7 other people, all of them being ordained as elders. I was the lone deacon. We stood there, and the bishop, he laid hands over us. He said these words of consecration, and my whole family was there, and it was just the most beautiful thing I've ever been part of. Just this profound sense of, I felt like I was going to be a pastor since I was 9, right? All these years, I'm 26, 27, 20 years of work, and it's finally happening. I'm finally becoming a pastor. When I get back to church the next Sunday, and the United Methodist Church deacons are slightly different understanding than what you have in Catholicism, but I go back to church, and the senior pastor that I worked for called me up and introduced me as Reverend Michael Armstrong. That title, I felt good, right? I've been working so long, Reverend Michael Armstrong. He told people he's no longer the youth minister, but he's the associate pastor, the number 2 of the church. And I was just so happy. But I remember in the back of my mind, that very Sunday, I never even said anything to Van about this, just thinking, that feels like a lie. That doesn't feel like me at all. I'm not Reverend Michael Armstrong. It was at first I dismissed it. It was just kind of this insecurity. It's a big change, a lot of stuff, very emotional. In your first couple of years as clergy in the Methodist Church, you're placed in a residency group. You have to complete your residency. So I had a group that I met with once a month, and about 6 months in, I told them, again, I hadn't even said a word to Vanna about this, and I told them, guys, I think I've made a mistake. I don't think I'm supposed to be here. I don't think I'm supposed to be doing this. I don't think this is right. Now, they all advised me, and it was the right call. Just finish the 3 years. Just get through your residency. Once you complete that residency, they can't do anything. They can't take anything away from you. You're like, great, you're done. And I tried to do that. But internally, we were happy at Lawrenceburg United Methodist. Things were clicking. All 3 of those fundamental questions were being answered. But internally, that realization, it spiraled it all back again. Who do I belong to? I'm not supposed to be here. What is my purpose? I'm not supposed to be pastor. What's my identity if it's not any of this? And I didn't know how to handle it. I dove into the only thing that I knew was right. I knew God had the answer. I knew that I needed more of God's grace to work through this. I wasn't about to quit again. I knew that was not an option. I couldn't quit again. So I dove into those places, those means of grace that I was formed in seminary. I dove into the scriptures as much as I could. I dove into service to the poor. I was trying to trailblaze and start this trailer park ministry, that trailer park by Bluebird Court. And I got funding for it and everything. I was trying to throw myself into service to the poor. And I was trying to throw myself into the sacraments as much as possible. But here's a big problem. In the United Methodist Church, the tradition is you receive the Eucharist just once a month. Some churches do it more, but it's the least attended Sunday a month. So most pastors aren't really looking to add that up. And I started to feel this hunger that I knew that I needed as much grace as possible because I couldn't handle this insecurity, and I'm trying to finish my 3 years in spite of all this. And I felt this hunger where okay, the other means of grace that are available, but what am I going to do about the Eucharist? How am I going to get it? I go back to seminary occasionally because they still do daily Eucharist every day at noon to this day. But Wilmore's an hour away. That's hard to get to. And I started to become obsessed with this idea and this realization that I was so hungry for the Eucharist, and just down the road at St. Lawrence Catholic Church, they were saying Mass every single day. I was so hungry for this means of grace. I just felt so strongly that this was somehow important if I was ever going to find clarity about these deep fundamental questions. And I couldn't get it in my head that St. Lawrence had what I needed. So I sent an email to Father Jeff. I got his email off the website. And he responded pretty quickly, which you all know is unusual for him. He does not usually get back to you, but he said he was hesitant because he thought it was a scam. He thought I was trying to get something from him. I asked him if I could just meet with him to talk, and he invited me to come meet at his office. It was some Wednesday afternoon. And we sat down. I just said, I'm one of the pastors down the road. Just had an interest in Catholicism. Just want to talk a little bit. Didn't say anything about conversion. Didn't say anything about the Eucharist. But again, you all know Father Jeff. He's very busy by nature. He said, okay, let's talk about that. But first, I need to finish some stuff up in my office. Can you just go hang out in the chapel and just chill for 15 minutes, and then I'll come get you? I said, sure. So he walks me over to this little chapel over here. And he stops me outside the door. And he said, they're doing Eucharistic adoration. Do you have any idea what that is? And I said, no, not a clue. And he said, well, just don't worry about it. Just go in and just sit and chill. So I did. I went in there and I sat down. And at first, I enjoyed myself. It was silent. There was one or two other people in there. For all I know, one of you all were in there. I don't remember any of that. And I remember seeing the monstrance. And I know it was. And I was just looking, trying to enjoy the symbols. And then I realized what was in the middle of that thing. What was in the middle of the monstrance. I realized I'm looking at the Eucharist. I'm looking at the sacrament. And it was just like this interior moment of all this hunger I felt, all this desire for God's grace to answer and settle these questions, to draw as close to God as possible. And then I'm just sitting there in this chapel. And it's like God's looking me in the face saying, here it is. Come and get it. There's very little holding you back. I want to give it to you. You just have to do it. And so Father Jeff came and got me, and we went back to his office, or one of those rooms over there. You all know he didn't keep an office. And I said, Father, I think I need to become Catholic. I went home that night. I told Vanna about what I'd done. And she was a little skeptical. She wasn't on board. She loved UMC. But she happened to be taking the next day off work anyways. I don't even remember why. We went and we met Father Jeff at a coffee shop, and Vanna had her chance to ask questions. So a few weeks after that I called my senior pastor and I called my bishop and I told them that I was going to be resigning, that we felt called to be Catholics. I agreed to stay on at LMC. We stayed on through January just to get everybody through the Christmas season. It's a busy time. Like I said, I love you. I love that church. I didn't want to leave on a sour note. And when I left the denomination, they made a note in my file that I was leaving under good standing, and they were very clear with me. If you ever want to come back, you can pick up right where you left off, which they knew I wouldn't, but I did appreciate that gesture. And then January 2020 was our first Sunday here at St. Lawrence. Those first few months of us being in the Catholic world, I mean, we weren't Catholic confirmed for a while still after. Those first few months were very scary for us. We were unemployed, no real hopes of a proper income. I have degrees in ministry. I studied Greek and Latin in college. Like I have no practical ability to make money. But then the Don Bosco Centers kind of fell in my lap, and some of you know about that. It was kind of a mixing of youth ministry and education. It worked for me. 2022, the diocese posted they were looking for a director of youth and young adult ministry, and I thought there's no chance in heck I'll get that job. But Vanna said, well, just send them your resume. Who cares? And I did. To my surprise, I've had that job for 3.5 years. So we've been in the church for 5 years now. And again, God has consistently, through the Catholic Church, asked us to revisit those three fundamental questions. Those questions of to whom do I belong? What is my identity? What is my purpose? I became Catholic because I was hungry for the Eucharist, because I knew that this was a source of grace. I'd been convinced that this is the truth. It's not as though when I became Catholic, though, suddenly all those questions went away and I just never had to worry about it again. It still has been, and sometimes still is, a struggle to figure out these things of God, what does this belonging look like? Who are you calling me to be? But the reason I'm Catholic, that's the point of this talk, right? Is why Catholic? The reason I'm Catholic is because I do believe God has the answer to that. And I do believe that this is the one church given to the world to help people find that. Right? Our hearts are restless till they rest in God. We're made for something. We just know it. And everybody out there is searching for it. And they'll try this for a while, they'll try that for a while. But this is the place I'm convinced that God brings us that final rest, where he leads us most fully and deeply into him and his divine life. So there it is. That's why I'm Catholic. Thank you. I am 5 minutes late. So if you have any questions, I'm happy to sit here and answer as long as you can. It's not rude to leave at this point because I have kept you long. But does anybody have any questions? No? All right. Well, thank you all. If I could lead us in a prayer to end, that feels appropriate after, all right? So please pray with me. In the name of the Father, and Son, and Holy Spirit, amen. Good and gracious God, we thank you for this day, and we thank you for this time that we can have together. God, we thank you for all these little blessings and all these little ways that you've pulled us and drawn us, all these breadcrumbs you have left along the path to call us deeper and closer to you. God, I ask that you open our eyes to the ways you're working in us and around us. Help us to see you and the ways you're working. Help us to love you better and better. We pray all these things in your holy name, in the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. All right, thank you, guys.